So here I was last night on this desk, again lamenting how weak our politicians and police have been in combating anti-Semitism, how their weakness has only increased the threat. And then by the end of the hour, as you know, we were hearing about explosives, arrests, covert investigations and anti-terror operations. The unspeakable atrocities of October the 7th, 2023 in Israel occurred on a Saturday. On the very next night, Australian Islamists celebrated on the streets of Lakemba in Sydney. And the night after that, the anti-Jew hatred spread to the Opera House, where the mob burned Israeli flags, chanted "F the Jews, where's the Jews?" and to the ears of many, gassed the Jews. Police stood back and watched. On that night, while that was unfolding, I was on air here, my first show after the October the 7th attack, warning that the response was too weak, that this would only get worse, that soon people would be blaming Israel and the Jews, blaming the victims of this vile atrocity. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to know this stuff. You just need to understand the facts, the history, and the ways of Islamist extremism and anti-Semitism and the awful politics of hatred. I mean, let me remind you, the day after 1,200 people were slaughtered, women, babies, the elderly, young women, men, people executed, burned alive, raped, defiled, tortured, 1,200 of them, and 250 people taken hostage, including babies, little children taken hostage. And the next night we saw this on the streets of Sydney.
It's a day of courage!
If you saw that and did not realise Australia faced a real and present danger, then you are either in denial, you're idiotic, weak, or all of the above. Then the next night, we saw this. So has there ever been a more sickening and dramatic warning about a threat to this country, to our Jewish population, to our national cohesion and to our national security? But the Albanese Labor government and the Minns Labor state government stood back, watched, wrung their hands and did nothing. They hoped if they just waited, it'd go away. Fools, irresponsible fools. That's why we're in this situation today. School children having to walk past ugly and threatening graffiti targeting Jewish people this morning. Kids exposed to hatred and threats. And police are trying to find out who was behind the caravan full of explosives, complete with a list of targets including a synagogue, and determine what they plan to do with it. That's where we are. And the situation has gotten worse week by week along the way. And those of us, including so many of you watching, those of us who have despaired about the lack of strength, lack of action and lack of moral clarity from authorities and political leaders, well, now we just feel enormously deflated and angry. Angry that those with the privilege of leadership have failed to lead. Peter Dutton has pushed for action all along. He gets it, and he wasn't holding back today, speaking the unvarnished truth.
This hasn't happened just overnight. You see, it's escalated. This is the point, and this is why I wrote to the Prime Minister after we saw the terrible circumstances on the steps of the Opera House. 2 days after people, including women and children, had been slaughtered in Israel, I wrote to the Prime Minister asking for a National Cabinet to be brought together because you could foresee that what we saw on the steps of the Opera House by these zealots and by these protesters was going to spread. The Prime Minister ignored that, and the Prime Minister has, for his own political purposes, sadly and tragically, decided to put the votes of Green supporters ahead of people in the Jewish community and in regional areas. That is the fact. And I have not seen a national leader conduct himself in such a way before. And so when we saw the spray painting of cars and of houses, did we think it was going to stop there? No. When you then see the bombing of a synagogue, did we think that it was going to stop there? No. When we saw the bombing or the attack on a childcare centre, did we think it was going to stop there? No. And are we surprised that these people now, with no red lines, having masqueraded as protesters when really they're just racist bigots who have been protesting on university campuses for months without the Prime Minister doing anything? Should we act surprised that this has escalated now to an attempted terrorist attack? No, we shouldn't. And the Prime Minister needs to show national leadership here to deal with the national crisis, and so far there's been no sign of it.
This is so bad. So bad for Jewish Australians who have been left exposed and vulnerable thanks to a recklessly pathetic response from state governments in New South Wales and Victoria, and especially from the federal government. Let me show you what the Federal Treasurer said today, arguably the second most important person in the federal government. Listen to what he said today after more than 15 months of anti-Semitism, graffiti attacks, fire bombings of cars, fire bombings of a synagogue and of a childcare centre, and now explosives found. And this is what he says.
This is obviously a terrifying development, and what it shows is that the fears that a lot of Australians in the Jewish community have are not always unfounded.
The fears of Jewish Australians are not always unfounded? What is he saying? What planet has he been on? Has he heard of the Holocaust? Does he know what happened on October the 7th? Has he not seen the hatred, the bile and the anti-Semitic attacks in Australia for the past 15 months? What a disgrace. Because look at this, it wasn't a slip of the tongue.
This is a chilling course of events, deeply troubling, unsettling, and what it shows is that the fears in the Jewish community are not always unfounded when it comes to the potential for these kind of violent acts. The revelations in the last day or so of this planned mass casualty event, you can see that some of the fear that Jewish Australians have is not unfounded.
This is all you need to know. Right at the upper echelons of the Albanese government, they don't take the threat to Jewish Australians seriously. Apparently these fears are sometimes unfounded. What a disgrace and what dangerous ignorance. Chalmers has since put out a statement apologising for failing to express himself more clearly. But he said the same thing 3 times in 3 different interviews. We're starting to see some leaders scale up their language.
It is utterly appalling and shameful that an individual would spray racist, hate-filled messages on a school. It tells you everything you need to know about how appalling these bastards are, that they would rip apart a school on one of the first days of school with a racist anti-Semitic attack. It is antithetical to everything that Australia represents in 2025. There are some terrible people in our community. I'm ashamed to say it, but that's the truth. Bad morals, bad ethics, bad people that will commit these acts. But Australians stand united against this appalling racism. Most Australians from every background regard this kind of hate-filled activity as the opposite of what it means to live in our country and our community in Australia in 2025.
Minns has always been stronger than the Prime Minister on this, but he hasn't done enough. And this is Anthony Albanese's version of finally upping the ante.
There's zero tolerance in Australia for hatred and for anti-Semitism. And I want any perpetrators to be hunted down and locked up. It's as simple as that. They have no place in this sort of engagement. It's designed to create fear and terror in the community, and it will not succeed because our community is stronger than the cowards who engage in this sort of activity.
The wet lettuce. You see, you can't undo, anyway, 15 months of weakness with belated attempts to talk tough. The problem here is that the anti-Jewish hatred is linked to the political debate, where those who have portrayed Hamas as some kind of Palestinian liberation force rather than the bloodthirsty Islamist extremists that they are, and who have portrayed Israel as the aggressor rather than the victim attempting to protect its people and preserve its security. Well, those people only foment hatred against Israel and then eventually, of course, against all Jews. The insipid actions by Labor to support Palestinian aspirations on the back of Hamas's October the 7th horrors and to continually call on Israel to pull back, and how they abandon Israel at the UN and in public debate, well, all that stuff from Albanese, it only fuels the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic toxins. Albanese has never called for Hamas to surrender, end its terrorism and therefore end the war. His calls have always put the onus on Israel for a ceasefire.
We want humanitarian pauses as a necessary first step. We've said that any step on a path to ceasefire can't be one-sided.
We showed the extent of our cooperation with the joint statement we made with Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, condemning Hamas's terror attacks on Israel, supporting urgent international efforts towards a sustainable ceasefire. Our government has consistently and repeatedly called for a ceasefire.
Yeah, Albanese just doesn't get it. He could do worse than listen to the Palestinian expert who grew up in Gaza, who joined me last night.
But it is indisputable that Hamas viewed spilled Palestinian blood as necessary to show us as victims, to show the bloodied Palestinian bodies and force the international community to react against Israel.
Yeah, that's the truth. But the protesters on the streets and in the universities, they run with the Hamas propaganda. And too many in government and politics fall for the same awful lies. They've accused Israel of bombing a hospital, wrong, of targeting aid workers, wrong again, and of trying to starve Palestinians, wrong. Government leaders in this country and around the world, they need to call these lies out, not give credence to them. Otherwise, they are fueling hatred that's dangerous and tears our country apart.